2022 is over, finished, and it's time we take a look back at some of the great anime that came out in this year. Now, I'm going to be splitting this video into two parts. One, to talk about the anime that I liked and generally would like to recommend to people, and another to talk about my best of year and a few shows that I either haven't finished or haven't gotten to yet. So if a show is not in this part, it very well may be in part 2. And I can't guarantee if part 2 will be the video after this. It probably won't, but it will be coming. Without any further ado, let's get into 10 of my favorite anime from this year. We're going to start off where most people started the year off, with My Dress Up Darling. I had some concerns going into My Dress Up Darling, specifically because it was being animated by Cloverworks, and Cloverworks has developed a bit of a reputation for when they do too many anime at once, usually something kind of falls through the cracks and doesn't end up doing very well. And in this previous winter season, there was a show that didn't do very well, the Tokyo 24th Ward, which had production issues even before it started airing. But thankfully, My Dress Up Darling was not a show that struggled with production issues and ended up being a very enjoyable rom-com, with our two lead characters coming from different places and from different backgrounds, but still finding something in common to bond over and ultimately develop a friendship and eventually maybe a romance. We're in a weird spot where we don't know exactly how the romance is going to progress from this point on, but thankfully we are getting a second season, so hopefully it'll progress relatively well and won't stall out. I am hopeful, and this ended up being a very charming series that I'm sure most people will find something to enjoy in. Moving on to spring, I think it's only fair we start off with Ya Boy Kong Ming, a show that I don't think anyone was really expecting much out of before the season began. Certainly I wasn't. It definitely caught me off guard, primarily because the premise is, well, strange to say the least. This ancient Chinese strategist being reincarnated in the modern world to help a struggling singer. It's weird, but it works. And it works because the characters are as charming as they are, and also because the music is as good as it is. I mean, even just the opening and ending are both fantastic songs, and that's not even talking about any of the actual songs present in the show itself. This was a very, very surprisingly good series, and one that, I don't know if we'll get another season for, but even if we don't, I'm content with what we have here. It's very charming, and it's something that you shouldn't necessarily judge just based on the unusual type of premise that it has. Speaking of premises maybe making people not watch shows, Kotaro Lives Alone, a Netflix series that also didn't really have a lot of people talking about it before it actually came out. Certainly, again, it was not on my radar, and it was a show that when I first read the premise, I was kind of like, this doesn't sound that appealing. And the reason why is because the premise sort of makes it sound like something different than what it actually is. This is very much so in the same vein of shows like Bunny Drop or Barakamon, or all the myriad of shows that have come out over the years that are basically people sort of taking on parental roles out of the blue. And while these characters in Kotaro Lives Alone are not actually his parents or becoming his parents, they do take on a similar role and try to help this kid who is very much so struggling with things, even if he doesn't project that very much. And the weird thing about the premise for this show is that it made it almost sound like more of a comedy than it was. Not that there aren't comedic moments, of course there are, but the description almost made it sound like Kotaro was just like this genius rich kid who was going to make his neighbors feel inadequate. And that's not at all what the show ends up being. So if you've gotten that vibe from reading about the show, it is not that. This is a very heartwarming show that also has its very, maybe not dark, but sometimes hard to watch moments going into the characters' backstories that really make you feel for them. Like, if you enjoy shows like Bunny Drop, you will like this. It is definitely worth your time if it sounds appealing to you based on how I'm describing it, not necessarily based on the premise. And in a similar vein to that type of subgenre of show, we also have Daimon, Recipe for Happiness. Another thing that's similar to Bunny Drop, where you have characters who have to take on a surrogate parental role for someone who doesn't really have their actual parents in their life. This one I really, really liked the art style for, and I really liked a lot of the supporting characters, even more so than the main, like, kid who's being helped out here. Like, the supporting cast really, really helps this show out, and it ended up being one I really liked. It was one I thought about talking about going into the spring season, but there just wasn't like a lot of information on it at the time. But definitely a show that I ended up liking. Again, very similar to Kotaro Lives Alone, just maybe a little less dark at times, and very similar to things like Bunny Drop. If you like those types of shows, both of them will do you well. And sticking with spring, we have Love After World Domination, a show that is effectively a parody of things like Power Rangers, Super Sentai, but in this case you have the Red Ranger, effectively, Red Gelato, falling in love with one of the primary antagonists. And it is hilarious. It is a show where you have these two characters who have no idea what they're doing as far as being in love, and they constantly have to hide their romance from their respective teams, because it's a show that really tries to kind of show, like, okay, if we really had a Power Ranger team or a Super Sentai team and these weird kind of villains trying to take over the world, how would the villain team recruit new people? How would the Ranger team get support to do what they're doing to fight against the evil forces? Like, it does make it seem more realistic in a sense, and sort of ask like the questions you might not have thought to ask about shows like that. But again, this is primarily a romantic comedy with a lot of focus on the comedy of the two characters hiding their romance from their respective teams in various strange and silly ways, and also just showing how absurd things like the villains can tend to be. It's very enjoyable, especially if you have an interest in Power Rangers or Super Sentai, but even if you don't, I think this is a genuinely enjoyable rom-com on its own, especially because, hey, Destiny is a fantastic character and she deserves way more acknowledgement and respect than she seems to have gotten. Definitely don't sleep on this one. Let's move into summer and talk about Licorice Recoil, another show that I did not really talk about in my seasonal discussion, although I did give it a mention because it was a show we really didn't seem to know a lot about at the time. It just had some key visuals and the PVs didn't really tell us a lot, but this is a show that really kind of took people by storm when it came out. I don't think it's a stretch to say it was probably the biggest new show of the summer season. And yeah, I mean, it was a very enjoyable, fun show. Even if the premise is one you're gonna have to kind of just accept, like, this is very much so oh, here's a bunch of girls with guns with a secret government organization basically training them to be assassins. That's not new for anime. I mean, we've had Gunslinger Girl for 2 decades now, but it's a premise that not everyone is going to get behind. It's something you're just going to have to accept as being reality in this world. They make it work pretty well. That being said, the main thing that is going to make this show work for you, and I think for the vast majority of viewers, is Chisato. Chisato carries this show hard. She is just such a likable and charming character and a fun character to watch that she makes up for a lot of the kind of like whatever moments in this show. Now, unfortunately, she's really the only character that I can look at and be like, yes, fantastic, because most of the other characters are just kind of there and unfortunately don't get a lot of backstory. Like, maybe you get some bits and pieces, but not enough to really make them particularly memorable. I will say, at least in Takina's case, she does grow and develop as a character, so I will give her that. She is memorable in that respect, and with her just general bond with Chisato. But Takina's growth is very much so expected. It goes down the route you would immediately expect it to, and that doesn't make it bad, it just makes it maybe a little boring and predictable. But that being said, even if just for Chisato alone, you should check this show out if you haven't. Call of the Night is another one from summer I want to acknowledge, and while it's not a show that I think I got as much out of as I think others did, it was still one I enjoyed, primarily for the way it portrays nighttime. You know, we typically think of the night in kind of a negative fashion as being, you know, dark and creepy and scary, and this is a show that really kind of shows a different take on nighttime by making it very inviting and warm and calming. Something we just don't typically see. Now, granted, it's showing it in a Japanese city, which is typically a nicer place to be, but nevertheless, it really does go out of its way to show why would characters want to be night owls and spend a lot of their time in the night. And in addition to that, the characters are fairly likable. I will say that the main shortcomings here are that there is a very sizable supporting cast in this show, and a lot of them just don't get anything to do, or at least not anything meaningful. And I do think the decision to have a new character and important plot point introduced very close to the end of the series and not get fully resolved maybe wasn't the best decision. If it gets another season, it won't matter, but it does kind of make the ending of it feel a little bit awkward just because you want to see where this will go and you don't. But that being said, for its portrayal of the night in a very unique way, I do think you should be giving this show a look. And now we'll move into the fall season. We'll start off with Do It, Yua Serufu. That pun is interesting. It's, so the main character is named Yua Serufu. Do it, Yua Serufu. Yourself. Do it yourself. And my God, they will say do it yourself every time they are about to do something, and it does get a little bit grating, but this is an enjoyable cute girls doing cute things show. In this case, they're doing do-it-yourself projects in a world that is somewhat more technologically advanced than ours in the fourth industrial revolution, and these characters are trying to sort of hold on to the more simple things, trying to just build something by hand rather than having like a robot do it. And there is a lot of charm in that, and I do generally like the good, positive feelings that this show generates. But I do feel like some of the characters could have been given a little more focus. There are 6 main characters, and they don't all feel equally relevant. But for what it is enjoyable. If you like shows like this, you should give it a watch. It may not blow you away, but it should be worth your time. Next, let's talk about the one that probably took most people by storm this season, being Bocchi the Rock. And I will say up front, I don't love this show like a lot of people love this show, because a lot of people adore this show through and through. I liked it. It was something that took a few episodes to really grab me, but I did end up liking it, mostly because Bocchi is a fairly relatable character. Yes, her social anxiety is taken to an obvious extreme to be comedic, but she does have a lot of charm, and it does allow the show to leave some fond memories behind. That being said, Bocchi is very much so what will determine your opinion on this show. It's weird that there are a few shows like that this year, where like one character is the determining factor. If you like Bocchi, especially if you love Bocchi, this show will do something for you. If you get sick of Bocchi and get sick of the comedy that is derived from her social anxiety, you probably won't like this show. She will make or break it, because unfortunately the other 3 main characters and all the supporting characters are kind of forgettable at the end of the day. Like, Kita at least has a little bit, I think primarily because she gets a bit more screen time due to being Bocchi's classmate. But again, like, Bocchi is the make or break here. The other characters are probably not going to carry the show for the majority of people. They're going to be there, they're not going to be bad, but they're not going to be especially memorable. That being said, if the type of character that Bocchi is sounds appealing to you, you would be remiss to not check this out. And finally for this video, let's talk about Raven of the Inner Palace, a show that kind of had my interest when it was first announced, but I wasn't entirely sold on at first, but thankfully ended up being a very pleasant surprise when I sat down and watched it. I really like shows that have this episodic bend to them, but with supernatural elements being dealt with every single episode. It reminded me in a lot of ways of Natsume's Book of Friends. Obviously, it's not the exact same type of show as that, but it has a similar premise where characters are dealing with something supernatural, in this case, ghosts and spirits, and trying to solve them while there is still something being achieved episode by episode. I really liked the characters in this. Even the supporting characters, I generally felt like they all added something, even if they aren't individually the most memorable. As a whole, there's a lot to like about them, especially our leads. And on top of that, I just think the world itself is very atmospheric and likable, and I'd really love to see another season of this. I don't know if that's going to happen, but I can dream. And by the way, the ending theme is fantastic. Give it a listen. So those are 10 shows that I really ended up liking from this year. Again, these are not everything that I enjoyed from this year. We do have part 2 to go into and talk about my best of year and a few other remaining shows. So look forward to that in the coming weeks. Until then, please like and subscribe if you enjoyed this video. Take care, and I'll see you all in part 2.